Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I think this might be the first time in a long time that I've spoken to an audience where I don't see any familiar faces. You all are strange to me. I don't mean it that way. I just mean strange. But I don't think she gave any bio about me. I'm not a maritime specialist. I just tell stories here on the Cape, and I talk about things that interest me, and I try to research them as deeply as I can in a reasonable amount of time. And a lot of them have to do with crime. So this is more the crime aspect, if you will. I'm not going to be talking too much about measurements of ships and, you know, all that kind of thing. There'll be a little bit of that because I assume a lot of you are interested in maritime subject matter. You're probably all members of this museum, maybe? Okay, a lot of you are. Well, thanks for coming. A little bit of background. I was a district court judge in the Commonwealth for 15 years. I was the first justice in Edgartown District Court for 10 years. I was the presiding justice of the Southern Division of the Appellate Division for 10 years. Before that, I was an assistant attorney general for a while, and then before that, I was a private practice lawyer in Western Mass. So that's what I did to make the big money. And, now I'm doing this because I just love it, so I really appreciate your coming out. If anybody needs or wants to get up at any time to go get another beer or a piece of cheese or a cookie, please feel free. I'll probably make some remark about you, but other than that, it wouldn't be a problem at all. Let me start off by saying, some of you have probably been to Sturgis Library in Barnstable Village. Big maritime collection there. And also in that library is a rare copy of the first edition of what many critics since the 1920s have considered the greatest American novel. It was first published in 1851. The reception for the novel, and for some decades thereafter, was pretty lukewarm at best. But then people started focusing on Moby Dick by Herman Melville exactly 100 years ago, 1924, when Melville's novella Billy Budd Sailor was published. I think I lost my little, there it is. By then, Melville had been dead for 33 years. The person most responsible for the publication of that story and some other posthumous works by Melville was his widow Elizabeth, whose father was Chief Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court Lemuel Shaw, who was born in West Barnstable and was the Chief Justice from 1830 to 1860, the most influential state court justice in the United States in the 19th century. So that guy, Chief Justice Shaw, Herman Melville's father-in-law. Elizabeth, Melville's wife, found kind of the shuffled pages of Billy Budd in a tin box, and she tinkered around with them for a little while, trying to edit them, and I think finally gave up and had some other people do it. Billy Budd concerns, I know you're asking yourself, what does that have to do with a mutiny? We'll get there. Billy Budd concerns a handsome, innocent, almost angelic, very popular with the crew, sailor aboard a Royal Naval vessel called the Belle Potent. Because he's so angelic, he becomes kind of a target of the sergeant of arms, or the master of arms, I should say, of the ship, a guy called Claggart. And Budd's sort of tragic flaw is that he stutters dramatically. And especially when he gets rattled or nervous, he becomes pretty much incomprehensible and can't speak. So he is accused at one point by Claggart of conspiring with some other people on the ship to foment a mutiny, which is absolutely false. And he becomes very upset, overcome with the injustice of this unfair accusation, and he strikes out at Claggart and he accidentally kills him. And the ship's captain is a guy named Beer. He doesn't believe that Billy Budd was planning a mutiny. He doesn't believe that he is morally responsible for having killed Claggart. But they do a drumhead court-martial, sort of a summary proceeding, if you will, to deal with the offense. And Billy is convicted of murdering Claggart. The fact that he didn't have any intent to do so is irrelevant, and Billy is hanged on the ship the following morning. In the summer of 1842, Melville was aboard a New Bedford whaling ship called the Acushnet. He and a friend deserted that ship in the Marquesas. Serious disobedience on the ship, obviously, to desert from the ship, but it's a little bit short of mutiny. Melville was picked up, and he was jailed in Tahiti briefly for refusing to obey orders, that is, committing a mutiny. And that same year, his cousin, his first cousin, a guy named Gert Gansevoort, was serving as the, that's not him, that's Melville, as it says. Gansevoort was serving as the first lieutenant on the United States naval vessel USS Somers. So he was the second highest ranking officer on the ship. There was a charismatic figure on the Somers, but he was not an innocent like Billy Budd was. Philip Spencer was a handsome 18-year-old midshipman, junior officer. He was born in Canandaigua, New York, 1823. He had strabismus, which is sometimes referred to as wandering eye, sometimes cruelly referred to as being wall-eyed. He had surgery without any anesthetic to correct that condition. The surgery did not work. His awareness of this was a big thing, I guess, with him, because he was otherwise this charismatic, handsome guy. His awareness could not have helped the volatility of his personality. He was a very volatile guy, very passionate guy. He went to Geneva College, which is now Hobart College in New York, where he had a reputation of being wild and ungovernable. He helped found a fraternity there that still exists. He was deeply interested in this book, The Pirate's Own Book, which is a collection of lurid and melodramatic tales of everybody's favorite buccaneers at the time. It was first published in Boston in 1837, so it was pretty fresh work when Spencer got to it. These stories that appear in this volume, probably a lot of them involve women like this being abducted, which is not pleasant, but very much attractive reading for some young men of that era. And it was so attractive to Spencer that he was inspired to head here to Massachusetts. He got to Nantucket, he signed on to a whale ship, but his father found him just in time and convinced him that if he was so determined to go to sea, at least go as a gentleman, that is, an officer. And it turns out that Spencer's father could probably get him a spot on a ship, since his father, John Spencer, was a member of President John Tyler's cabinet. He was the Secretary of War, so pretty well connected. The Secretary of War, the Department of War, became the Department of Defense in 1947. John Spencer was a rigid, by-the-book guy, apparently zero sense of humor at all. His son was not that at all. The first ship on which Philip Spencer served, he got intoxicated. He assaulted a superior officer twice. He was transferred to his second ship. He was on shore leave in Rio de Janeiro. He got into a fight with a Royal Naval officer once. He was not court-martialed. You might have noticed that sometimes in life strings are pulled, and someone who should be punished, or at least upbraided in some fashion, receive some kind of comeuppance, does not. Here, Spencer was simply shifted to one more United States naval vessel, the Somers. Here's a better rendering of it coming up. The Somers was a brig that was launched as a training vessel. It was only 100 feet long, so essentially the same length as the Mayflower. 25 feet at the beam. It was launched in April 1842. Took a shakedown cruise to Puerto Rico over the summer, and in September it began its true mission, creating sailors and officers for the United States Navy. It was kind of an experimental training ship. It was intended to convert wayward boys, who were often referred to at that time as the sweepings of the street, into United States naval personnel by their acting as apprentices on the ship. This is New York 50 years after the time period we're talking about, so you can imagine what it was like 50 years earlier. I don't think that same horse was there. It was still pretty nice. So the first voyage that they went on, they sailed to Africa, and their mission was to deliver some dispatches to a ship called the Vandalia. Somers had a crew of 120. 90 of that crew were in their teens. Half of those 90 were young teens, 14 years old to 16 years old. So they're all jammed onto this crowded ship. It's essentially an inescapable floating cell filled with 120 men and boys. Most of them were hormonal teenagers. Many of them were the sweepings of the street. Doesn't seem like anything could go awry. So, given his sterling record in the U.S. Navy by that point, and again, he's 18 years old, Spencer was a junior officer, a midshipman. He grew very popular with a lot of the apprentice sailors, chiefly because he would supply them with tobacco and with rum. He was attractive to them anyway, too, because he rebelled against the U.S. Navy customs and the rigor of the training. He was apparently especially friendly with a bosun's mate named Samuel Cromwell and a seaman named Elisha Small. That's all we know about, and that's not even that. So there's very little known about these two men, except both of them had reportedly served on slave ships. Cromwell was a large man, especially intimidating to many of the very younger sailors. He had a very fearsome reputation, and that, of course, was polished up by his slave ship experience. So that's why he's the bigger one there. And now, by now, you're probably wondering who the captain of the Somers was. This was a guy named Alexander Slidell Mackenzie. He was born in New York City in 1803, so he was about 39 when the events that we're going to be talking about happened. He was actually born Alexander Mackenzie Slidell. He legally reversed the order of his names explicitly so he could claim an inheritance from a maternal uncle. That was the condition of him cashing in, so he did it. He was generally known to be tough on his crews. He would flog them for such behavior as being insufficiently quick in fulfilling the tasks that they were assigned, and in being disorderly and other typical teenage behavior. The ship, though, was a floating world. And if disorder on a ship were allowed to blossom, that world obviously was in dire jeopardy. However that might be, a flogging, you have to keep in mind, and you probably already have, is a brutal punishment. It is essentially torture. It's carried out with a cat o' nine tails, which consists generally of 9 braided, knotted, and tarred ropes. These would literally, if enough strokes were applied, probably wouldn't take much, would flay a person's back. Just open it up. The younger sailors might be punished by means of a little device called a colt, which was something not quite this damaging to the skin and the muscles. Besides the physical effects of flogging, it's all done, obviously, in the full view of the crew as a deterrent and has a way to shame the flogged sailor. It's one representation of flogging. Here's another one. And overarching that whole punishment is the echoes that it has in chattel slavery. Being flogged emphasized sort of an identification with the most degraded and rights-deprived Americans at the time, enslaved Southern field hands. Mackenzie again. He was a lifelong friend of Washington Irving, the legend of Sleepy Hollow, and on and on and on. Mackenzie was something of a writer himself. By the time of the Somers incident that we will get to, he had published 6 books. A couple of them were about Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, who was his brother-in-law. Naval hero, Lake Erie, War of 1812. He was the guy with the flag that said, "Don't give up the ship." He was the guy who said, "We have met the enemy and he is ours." Mackenzie's other brother-in-law was Commodore Matthew C. Perry, who was the guy involved with the Perry expedition in the 1850s that ended the self-imposed isolation of Japan and opened up Western trade between Japan and other nations in a maneuver often called gunboat diplomacy. A lot of things can be accomplished, apparently, or at least could be in the 19th century, by pulling up somewhere with a ship and saying, "See how many cannon we have? This is what we want." So, usually worked. This guy, Perry, also played in the Florida Keys for the United States. Mackenzie had entered the Navy as a midshipman in 1815. By 1841, he was a commander. During that career, he had fought against pirates in the Mediterranean and in the West Indies. He was related by marriage to the most revered U.S. naval family of the 19th century, the Perrys, as I just mentioned. And that possibly could have maybe sort of in a way helped his naval career a little bit. Now, we've left the Somers off the western coast of Africa with its dispatches for Vandalia. They have not found the Vandalia off of Africa, and so they set off from Africa to sail to the Virgin Islands, which were not yet territories of the United States. They were hoping to catch the Vandalia in St. Thomas before continuing their voyage on to New York. In late November, the Somers was less than 2 weeks from St. Thomas when the ship's purser and Gansevoort, Melville's cousin, came to Mackenzie and delivered to him some disturbing news. 20-year-old purser's steward Josiah Wales told them that the previous day Spencer had asked him, Wales, to join a mutiny. The plan, if it was that, was to take over the Somers and kill the officers. The mutineers would then turn pirate. The Somers would transform from a U.S. naval vessel to a pirate ship. While this conversation was going on between Spencer and Wales. Alicia Small, whose silhouette you saw a few moments ago, joined in the conversation, and it appeared to Wales that he knew what was going on and he was a party to this whole proposal. So Mackenzie at first did not take this report seriously, but he did ask Gansevoort, Melville's cousin, to watch the crew and especially watch and keep mind of what Spencer was up to. Another picture of Spencer, similar to the first one. So keep your eye on Spencer for any suspicious activity. Gansevoort reported back very shortly, said that some of the crew had told him that Spencer, Cromwell, and Small together met nightly in secret. Seems suspicious. Spencer was also was seen having examined a map of the West Indies, and he was also tattooed in the foretop, which is not a body part. It's part of the ship up in the sails. Apparently that's where you go to get tattooed on one of these ships. So he had also asked somebody about a device called a chronometer, which was very helpful in celestial navigation. And he asked people about the Isle of Pines, which was a notorious home in the Caribbean for pirate activity. Spencer had also drawn a picture of the ship, the Somers, flying a black flag. And another key piece of evidence, Gansevoort had seen on Spencer, quote, the most infernal expression I have ever beheld on a human face. It satisfied me of his guilt. So, all that put together, Spencer was arrested, held in irons on the quarterdeck. His locker was searched, and in his locker was found a list of names written in Greek. There were 4 people listed as certain. Himself, Small, Wales, who's the guy who reported them, and E. Andrews. There's nobody on the ship named Andrews. Others were listed as doubtful, and 18 of the crew were listed as people to be kept on board, whether they were willing or not. The following day, after these discoveries were made, Mackenzie was convinced that Small was involved in a situation where he was trying to create a diversion so that Small and Cromwell could rescue Spencer, still sort of tied up in chains there on the quarterdeck. Small and Cromwell were both arrested. They were shackled on the quarterdeck as well. And by the 29th, 4 more people were arrested, shackled on the quarterdeck. Mackenzie later said that he had to protect the Somers, he had to protect the Somers crew, and he felt an obligation, obviously, to protect any vessels that Spencer might attack in the future. And above all, and these are his words, to guard from violation the sanctity of the American flag displayed from the masthead of one of its cruisers. It was probably significant to the officers after these things transpired and these guys were in shackles on the deck. It was significant to them probably because they were probably people who were likely to be able to navigate the Somers. They were the people with experience on other ships and fighting, but they could probably navigate the thing if they wanted to. And also significant, at least to Mackenzie, was the fact that Spencer's father was the Secretary of War in President Tyler's cabinet. And he didn't want Spencer, that is, Mackenzie didn't want Spencer on the ship to begin with. And he was sort of the mind that if we take these malefactors back to the U.S., nothing's going to happen to Spencer. More strings are going to be pulled, and he is going to escape punishment for what I think he's done here on the Somers. Mackenzie, to address this issue, asked his 7 orders in writing for advice as to how to proceed, because he was, and this is another quote from him, particularly anxious that no shadow of doubt should remain as to the guilt of the prisoners should their execution be deemed necessary. He had already decided it was. The officers interrogated some of the crew. On the 30th of the month, they gave Mackenzie a written report, recommending that Spencer, Cromwell, and Small be executed. Now, by now, you might be wondering when the court-martial was. There wasn't one. Court-martial procedure is somewhat similar to the familiar civil court procedure that we mostly know about. There's a preliminary hearing to determine whether there's sufficient evidence of a charged offense to proceed to trial. And at the trial, the prosecution presents evidence, offers testimony, which is subject to cross-examination. Here, there was no real testimony at all, never mind testimony subject to cross-examination. If there's a guilty verdict in a regular court, there's a sentencing and an appeal process. None of that here. There couldn't have been, given the very small number of officers that were aboard. So there's no hearing here at all, not even a summary drumhead court-martial. If they had done that, they might have been able to afford these suspects some rights, but they didn't. Essentially what happened here was there was a meeting of officers. They spoke to some of the crew members. A lot of the information obviously would have been hearsay. Doesn't matter. That's good enough for us. That's the end. Now, of course, the commander of a ship has the right, the power, and the duty to use deadly force to put down a mutiny. But when that had been done in the past, there was an actual mutiny. There was some kind of overt act of armed disobedience or violence. There was no overt act here. In Billy Budd, the act was Billy's killing Clagger, and his intent in having done that was irrelevant. Here, there's no act at all. So what they have here is only intent. Maybe. Evidence of that is ambiguous at best. So the theory has been floated that Spencer's behavior could have been late adolescent fantasy rather than an actual plan for an imminent mutiny. He might have been playing some kind of weird game. He might have been trying to mold some of the crew members into a kind of fraternity, which he had formed when he was back in college in New York. None of that was taken into account. The following afternoon, the entire crew was mustered on deck. There were 3 whips, ropes, lying along the deck. These had been run up to and over the yardarm, which is a cross member on the mast, I'm sure you know. And now might be a good time to go over all the hundreds of components of the rigging of a ship like the Somers. This is an abbreviated version of it. But the yardarm, you know that. 36 feet above the deck. There's some guys on the yardarm over there. They are sailing here from Hyannis to Edgartown. It's Australia. So the lines are up over the yardarm. The 3 condemned men standing on the deck, they are manacled. They're standing there with nooses around their necks. Their heads are covered. The signal for the crew to haul on the lines would be a shot from a little cannon called a carronade. So that's how we're going to hang these guys. the crew is going to grab a hold of the lines and run. More about that in a minute. So that's what we're waiting for, that carronade to sound off. Grab the lines and run. Spencer, who's the head suspect here, asked Gansevoort if he could give the signal. And that permission was granted. Mackenzie then talked to each man, mostly along the lines of telling them it was his duty to the government, to the crew, and to ships unknown, and of course a higher duty to the flag of my country. And Small looked up at the rigging and said, "God bless that flag." Spencer reportedly around that time told his shipmates that he deserved to die, but he couldn't bring himself to give the order to fire the cannonade. And in that pause, Smith and Cromwell also wanted to address the crew. Small said he had never killed anybody. He was being executed for saying that he would. And he said, as a lesson to the other crew, see what a word will do. He said that it had been his service on a slave ship that had brought him to this ignoble point. He warned his shipmates to stay clear of those kinds of vessels. Cromwell asked his wife and a friend to be told that he had died an innocent man. Gansevoort spoke to Spencer again. He reported to Mackenzie that Spencer still could not bring himself to give the signal, and Mackenzie immediately yelled, "Stand by, fire." Gansevoort yelled whips, and the crew holding on to these lines, who were surrounded by armed officers, ran. 2:15 in the afternoon. Now there are 2 points here I'd make. One is that some writings suggest that the crew ran quickly in the hopes of breaking the necks of the 3 condemned, thereby giving them a quick death. Before at least the 1840s, and here we are in 1842, when people were hanged, they were strangled. These are the 3 here. Trying to get to the lurid part as soon as I can. This being strangled in this fashion could take time. This could take 15 to 20 minutes. The hope was that consciousness would leave the person within 6 to 15 seconds. Didn't always happen. So it wasn't going to be good either way. What is known as the long drop method of hanging that you see, where somebody stands on a platform and the lever is pulled or whatever, and the person drops after their weight has been calculated and all that kind of stuff. That was done with the intention that the sudden jerk at the end of the fall would break the person's neck and kill him immediately. That didn't always work either. But whatever, the crew members here were not going to be able to run fast enough to pull these 3 men 36 feet up in the air and break their necks. It just wasn't going to happen. The second point I would make at this juncture is that I sometimes talk about another really actual bloody mutiny involving a whale ship called the Globe. There was a mutiny on that ship in the South Pacific in 1824, beg your pardon. The ringleader of that mutiny ordered the execution of one of the crew members by hanging in the same way that it was being done here. But it's usually concluded that when he did that, he did it so that the mutineers were actively participating in the execution of the person being lifted above. And that would make them, in this head mutineer's eyes, directly complicit in murder. It's one thing to make the young Somers crew watch many floggings, but it seems another to order them to put their hands on these lines and actually hang these 3 men. I don't know how else they were going to do it, but that's the way they chose to do it here. So as the three mutineers were hanging from the yardarm, Mackenzie launched into another speech justifying his actions. The crew was called to cheer the flag, which they did 3 times, very heartily, and then they went to dinner. Bodies were lowered around 3:30, so quite a while after the actual execution. A few crewmen prepared their bodies for burial at sea, which in Spencer's case involved, have questions at the end, sir, if you don't mind. That included making a casket for Spencer, which they made out of 2 wooden chests. Casket differs from a coffin, by the way. Coffin has 6 sides, tapered at the head and feet. 3 bodies were sewn up in their own hammocks. 32-pound cannonball was placed at each body's feet. Melville's 1850 novel, White Jacket, has a chapter called The Last Stitch. There has long been a story that when sailors were sewn up in their hammocks before their burial at sea, the sailmaker would run the needle through the person's nose, through the septum. And it's known as the last stitch. 2 reasons for this have been given. One is to ensure that the corpse is a corpse, because if you're not a corpse and somebody sticks a needle through the septum of your nose, you'll probably wake up. And the second was a superstition that if this were not done, the dead sailor would never rest and would probably emerge from the sea, possibly to haunt his old ship. So right around this time, there's a squall that lashes the Somers with wind and rain, and that passes fairly quickly. As night began to fall, Mackenzie read the funeral service between the lights of the battle lanterns that were hanging strung over the deck. The bodies slid off the plank into the Atlantic Ocean. Spencer's casket, when it hit the water, split open, and his hammock-shrouded body could briefly be seen before it joined Cromwell's body and Small's body on their descent to the bottom of the sea. 4 days later, 5th of December, the Somers docked in St. Thomas. Even though Somers had hoped to meet up there with the Vandalia, Mackenzie said later that he would never have dreamt of seeking the protection of his crew in a place that was foreign, that was not the United States. So there was criticism. Why did you hang these guys so precipitately? Why couldn't you wait a few more days until you got into St. Thomas? That wasn't going to work for Mackenzie because it was a foreign port. He wasn't going to say, I need to get these guys in custody here because I'm afraid of what they'll do if they get loose. He wasn't going to do it. So he wasn't going to do it there or really anywhere except maybe under the guns of an American man of war. And 9 days after they reached St. Thomas, the Somers docked in Brooklyn Navy Yard. 2 weeks later, the Secretary of the Navy ordered a court of inquiry. This body was charged with investigating the affair and then reporting to the Department of the Navy its opinion as to the right and propriety of what had happened. In other words, the hanging of these men at sea. In January 1843, the court unanimously exonerated Mackenzie from blame. This inquiry really had no legal effect, but it did set the stage for the next legal step in the matter. Mackenzie asked for a court-martial. He asked to be court-martialed. Why? Spencer's father, who you remember was the Secretary of War, along with Cromwell's widow, were trying to have Mackenzie and Gansevoort indicted for murder in the United States District Court. They took that case in there. The judge decided that the U.S. Navy's jurisdiction precluded that of a civil court. That it was a naval matter, not something for civil court. And he dismissed the indictments. He did leave open the possibility of a civil trial. Mackenzie wanted to safeguard himself from that possibility, a trial in civil court. So he wanted court-martial. 3 days after the Court of Inquiry's opinion, Mackenzie was charged with murder, oppression, illegal punishment, conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman, which was mainly based on an allegation that he had taunted Spencer before his execution, and cruelty and oppression of the crew. Mackenzie admitted that, as he had to, that he had ordered the executions, but argued that they were demanded by duty and justified by necessity. On the charge of murder, 9 voted to acquit, 3 voted to convict him. On the oppression, 8 voted to acquit, 4 voted to convict him. On illegal punishment, 12 people voted to acquit. The court could have acquitted him with honor. They did not. The entire Somers affair captured the attention of most of the country and many people abroad. This was a really heavily publicized big deal. The most famous people who weighed in on the thing with writings, James Fenimore Cooper, last of the Mohicans. He was, in addition to being one of the country's foremost novelists, was also a naval historian. And he wrote a 102-page tirade against Mackenzie. And it might have been at least partially because of Mackenzie's earlier criticism of the War of 1812 history that Cooper had written. Might have had a little bit of an animus there. Among other points in his writing, Cooper called Mackenzie a tyrant for his excessive flogging and for failing to provide these 3 accused with any rights. He said that the officers' council, which was before the court-martial, had been tailored to conclude, I beg your pardon, the officers' council on the ship had been tailored to come to the conclusion that the 3 men had to be executed. In the center there, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, he roundly praised Mackenzie. Charles Sumner, I don't know if you're familiar with Charles Sumner, a very interesting man. He was the guy who was almost beat to death on the Senate floor by a guy named Brooks from the House of Representatives because he was a big anti-slavery advocate, and he was sitting on his desk in the Senate, and this representative from South Carolina, I think, came up with a very heavy metal-tipped cane and started beating him before the guy could even stand up. And he was just covered in blood. He didn't even see what was happening. So he was out of the Senate for a long time. Charles Sumner. Anyway, he was on Mackenzie's side on this matter. And then for a little while, he was married. Sumner was married to William Sturgis's daughter. William Sturgis is the guy that Sturgis Library, Sturgis Charter Public School is named after. I'm sure you know about him. Very astute sailor and navigator. He criticized the court-martial. He said that Mackenzie's conduct was not good, and he observed in his writing that Cromwell, I firmly believe, had no more intention to capture the Somers and turn pirate than had Commander Mackenzie himself. So that was Sturgis's conclusion. Everybody knows the lithographer's courier in Ives. Much of what we think of as an idyllic celebration of New England wintertime, Christmas time, and the snow comes from their work. This is as festive as we're going to get, so soak that in for a couple seconds. But particularly, Nathaniel Currier before he went into partnership with James Ives, created scenes of current events. And one of the things he created was this much better rendering than the previous one of the Somers. Complete with two guys hanging beneath the flag.
Wow.
So this is the one you want to hang up in the dining room. If you can't get your hands on that Christmas sleigh picture. We didn't want to besmirch Spencer at all, so they just put two guys on there hanging, I guess. There they are, two of them. The Somers Affair, as it has come to be called, and as it was called then, was the only possible mutiny in the U.S. Navy. On one of the Facebook pages, I think it was from the museum here, a gentleman took issue with that and wanted to call another incident on a U.S. naval vessel during the Vietnam War a mutiny. The Navy never considered it a mutiny; they considered it a race riot. So, the question is whether this event was a planned mutiny at all. So, now I would say, what happened to these people? Because I always want to know what happens after they go through this stuff. Mackenzie, the captain there, 6 years after the Somers incident, he died at his home in Scarborough, New York, of heart disease. He was 45 years old. Gansevoort, Melville's cousin, took part in the Mexican War. He was promoted to commander in 1855. He helped defend Seattle from Native Americans in the Puget Sound War in 1856. During the Civil War, he was in charge of ordnance at Brooklyn Navy Yard. He was promoted to captain. He retired from the Navy in 1867, and he died in Schenectady, New York, the following year. He was 56. John Spencer ended his federal career as the Secretary of the Treasury. He died in Albany at the age of 67. As a result of this incident, the Somers incident, and the resulting scandal among senior U.S. naval officials, they were scandalized that a midshipman, even these very young, sort of fledgling people, but the midshipman Spencer, they were aghast that any midshipman in the U.S. Navy would even consider conducting a mutiny on a U.S. naval vessel. So it was a big deal among the naval personnel. So as a result of this whole thing, the U.S. Naval Academy was formally established in 1845 in Annapolis, Maryland. The following year, late 1846, the Somers, still in action, was blockading the port of Veracruz in the Gulf of Mexico during the Mexican War. The Somers, at that time, was commanded by Lieutenant Raphael Semmes, who might be a name familiar to some of you. He would go on to command the Confederate ship CSS Alabama during the Civil War. He was the most successful commerce raider in maritime history, capturing 65 ships as prizes. So, U.S. Navy, Mexican War, Confederate Navy, Civil War. He's commanding, and in December 1846, the Somers was chasing a blockade runner there in Veracruz when it capsized. What happened there? Where did that come from? Well, that's the close-up of the two guys. There's a ship. There's the two guys. I should have shown that earlier. There's the Somers. 1846. It capsized in a sudden squall. There was a crew on board of 80 men, and 36 of them drowned. And that was the end of that show. And that's the end of the talk. So, thank you. Again, thanks for coming. Anybody have any questions? I think this gentleman, yes.
Yes, there's one slide showing earlier where the three sailors were being hung.
Yes.
And in the background, it looked like an island with a cliff. Where was that?
That's a pictorial
It's just
fancy, I think, because they were still 4 days out from the Virgin Islands.
Okay.
It's something that got, I think that picture actually dates from later in the 19th century. Yeah. Yes.
How long did the whole process take on the ship itself when they decided that they were gonna charge these guys and then kill them? Like, what was that whole process? Was it days?
Yeah, 4 days maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah, very quick. That was part of the problem for Mackenzie when he got back to New York.
right.
Yes, yes ma'am.
Let's just say one of those young men who had to grab a rope said, "Not going to do it."
That's why they had the armed officers on both sides of them.
So you can't be insubordinate then. So if
That would be the
you're
wrong
insubordinate,
time.
Are you with?
Who knows? Apparently nobody did it. Everybody grabbed that line and ran. So if they hadn't, that, they'd have said, okay, now we need 4 lines.
No choice.
Anybody else?
Do you have any upcoming talks?
I do a lot, and if I had them, they'd be on here. I've got one in January, but it is going to be online for a private club here on the Cape. Anybody go to Tufts University? No. You probably won't see the talk then. That one is actually another talk about the Navy. I'm sure I'll do. I've done this one quite a bit. I think I've done it here a few years ago. It's about Mad Jack Percival. Anybody know him? Love him. Mad Jack Percival was.
Maybe you should come back and do another talk on that.
It's
I'll be happy to.
Okay.
Mad Jack Percival was also from West Barnstable, and he was a very colorful naval officer. And I referred earlier in my talk to the mutiny on the whale ship Globe. He was sent from South America to the south into the South Pacific to figure out what happened. Of course, it took a long time for word to get back. I won't do the whole talk now, but it took a while. But he sailed to the South Pacific to find out what had happened to those mutineers, and he did. And then he went on to Hawaii to cause some trouble there. Very colorful man, very interesting. Yes,
Was
ma'am.
Mackenzie that much worse than any other captain in that time? I mean, for floggings or something?
For floggings, he was generally considered to be among the worst.
Okay.
Yeah, a high number of people got flogged. And keep in mind, these are
Kids.
they're trying to instill discipline into them, and maybe it was a little too pungent at times. But they were kids. I mean, these are teenage. Keep in mind, 14, 15, 16-year-old kids on this thing. It's kind of tough. Yes.
If somebody wanted to know about your talks, is there a place they could give you their
Why, yes.
email address?
Why, yes. This is kind of easy to remember. This is my website. I throw a blog on there every once in a while.
Where people can put their email in
They could.
if they wanted to
They
be
could do
updated.
that. You could put your email into that situation. I was gonna.
Why, thank you.
I'm not good at the
No.
publicity thing.
No, he's not.
I was supposed to bring a bunch of cards. I might have a couple. I was supposed to bring a sheet so you could put your email address on there. I didn't do that either. Anyway, the Facebook really started out as the events thing, and it's still, I try to put something on there every day about some crazy historical thing. A lot of art on there. I go because I like art and that kind of stuff. And that's my email. So
I have another question.
that's the deal. Yes.
The 3 men that Cooper and there were 2 others that did a lot of media after this event or about this event.
Yeah.
Who were the other 2?
The one in the center of the slide was Senator Charles Sumner,
Sumner.
and the third one was William Sturgis, who was
Okay.
from Barnstableville
They were father-in-law and son-in-law, right?
for a while. That's a whole nother story.
That's what I was going to ask about.
Sumner ended up marrying Sturgis's daughter, who was a widow, and fairly soon after his marrying her, they lived in Washington, and she started being squired around town by a diplomat from Europe, and it was very in your face, to the point where Sumner started to be referred to as the Great Impotency, which is tough.
This poor guy, I mean, he was really kind of heroic in his anti-slavery stances, but he had some nasty things happen to him.
But they were, the father-in-law and son-in-law were opposite, had opposite opinions on
Yes.
this, right? So where did she fall in this, in that?
She fell into the sack with the
Well, she was so stressed out about her father and husband having different views. Okay.
She probably didn't have a big opinion on it. I'm guessing. I mean, I've never seen. You know, Sumner's writing was in the North American Review, which was a very widely distributed periodical. So he got a lot of attention for that. Sturgis's article wasn't that well distributed. Anything else about anything? Anything? There's a lot of side stories with these people. So, one of the things I like is, I've mentioned Sturgis, I've mentioned Lemuel Shaw, Melville's father-in-law, and now I've mentioned Mad Jack Percival. These guys all knew each other. They were from the Cape. They were all from Barnstable.
Oh, wow.
So, it's crazy. Yep. Anything else? Get some cookies? Thanks for coming.